To really properly explain how all this deception and transformation could be possible, it's necessary to talk a lot about the parasites and what they really are. They are the nanomachines run amok, evolved in the far future and transformed far beyond what they were created to be. In Metal Gear Survive, we see the nanomachines covering the planet and converting the population to zombie versions of their former selves by the 22nd century. They were meant to simply heal people by replacing their lost tissues and other structures with identical mimics of those structures crafted on the subatomic level. These nanomachines then presumably began to go beyond their human hosts and summarily ate everything they could convert to their own selves, causing a global apocalypse. In the Metal Gear Survive version of events, the nanomachines don't have wormhole technology in the 22nd century, and Seth has to steal it from the AI pod Virgil, which was sent from the past by Wardenclyffe, to Detae with this wormhole tech on board. What this implies is that there's a version of this timeline before Survive where the AI pod simply isn't there with wormhole technology to steal, leaving the nanomachines without a way to time travel back to when humans still existed. After all, the AI pod's technology is probably a result of a previous timeline having time travel in it, so at some point there must have been a version before they had wormhole technology in the 70s to send back to the future. Good Luck tells us that when we send Chris through the wormhole at the end of Survive's story, he actually ends up being sent back to 1943 with an iDroid on him, which is probably a hint as to where this advanced technology comes from in Metal Gear to begin with. Virgil is probably sent to the future with this wormhole technology on board to have it stolen on purpose in order to short-circuit the apocalypse by giving the nanomachines the ability to travel back to the past sooner than they would evolve it themselves, and thus enable their hive's destruction earlier in their evolution than would otherwise happen, so they're also weaker and easier to defeat. If they had evolved fully into parasites, they'd probably be a lot more complicated to deal with compared to what happens in Survive. So if Virgil just wasn't there, the nanomachines would in this version of the future have to keep developing their own way toward wormhole technology if they ever hope to have contact with humans again. These nanomachines are really just AI, so imagine how long it would take a lot of AI bots that weren't even meant to be AI bots to come up with something like wormhole teleportation through time. So the parasites probably did develop wormhole technology in a much longer first version of the timeline before Virgil had it, and that far future with the parasites is probably where humans in the 1940s originally got wormhole tech to begin with. I think this earlier future resulted in nanomachines evolving into what we know as the parasite, and then they opened a wormhole back in time to seed themselves in the origin of life when there was ample energy in the newly formed Earth to serve as a target for a wormhole. I think for these parasites' plan to work to reconnect with humans in the past, they first needed to sort of reboot existence on Earth to make a portion of everything a perfect mimic of that thing made of parasites, so that they become a natural part of the cycles of the planet's ecosystem. This action would also reboot the timeline, and in my mind represents where Metal Gear's reality diverges from our own. This would mean that in Metal Gear, some humans are made up of more parasite-made human-mimicking DNA than others, and potentially everyone has some form of the parasite's genetics in their DNA. You see, I don't think these parasites in the future could just dial up a specific date on their time travel machine. I'm gonna assume they don't have a DeLorean with a flux capacitor, so they probably need a target for these wormholes in the past because these wormholes are probably formed by a two-sided operation in both the past and in the future. In other words, you probably need energy going into a point in the past and the same thing happening in the future, and those two wormholes have to be tuned to each other somehow. So in order for the parasites to get back to humanity's existence to open a wormhole, they'd need to seed themselves into the past of existence first so that everything has some parasites in it, and then those can form a target. These wormholes spontaneously open from the apocalyptic future to the past during the time of humanity's existence in Metal Gear's alternate timeline, probably during mass death events when enough parasites slough off from the dead bodies and float in the air, coalescing as they're described to do in Survive to form sufficient energy to stabilize a wormhole at a singularity point in space. This keeps happening because the Lord of Dust exists in the future, and these points in the past all serve as potential invasion points. All that's needed is a catastrophic enough event in the past for this future apocalypse to spill over into reality. The wormhole generator we use in Survive is just collecting nanomachine dust from the atmosphere and converting it to energy, which is pumped into a singularity point above the digger, which then opens and stabilizes the wormhole for transport of material to the captain's crew stranded in the future. These singularities are probably also somehow related to the parasites in their operation, as they don't appear to be naturally occurring phenomenon in Survive's world, since wanderers tend to always appear from these portals when one digs from any wormhole in that game. Since humans in this version of the timeline had the parasite DNA already woven into their structure, their death and decay could serve as fuel to form a singularity point for a target in the past. According to Survive, these spontaneous wormholes appeared in Vietnam, dumping zombies in the jungle, prompting Wardenclyffe to get their people on the scene to suppress and cover up the incidents. So it's likely that these wormholes represent an ever-present threat of annihilation from the inevitable apocalyptic future Metal Gear's timeline always faces, manifest in the kaiju Lord of Dust. This kind of wormhole's formation would be to the locals of that time and place like an invasion from another world, where these zombie-like creatures spill through and start killing and eating people, converting them to be used against the living, while they accumulate more energy in the sky, likely aiming to open the wormhole wide enough for the bulk mass of the parasites to pass through. It appears the wormhole needs enough energy from both sides to open the door enough for something larger than a person to pass through. So a big war would mean a big wormhole. I like to imagine the size and shape of the Lord of Dust's multiple sections allow it to step through such a wormhole and position itself inside the portal, and from there it can begin to open more wormholes into the past to eat more versions of the world, while its other body segments exist across the created timelines all simultaneously to guide the parasites in each version of the past. The obvious candidates for these kinds of large mass death events in recent history are during World War I and II, and let's just stick with World War II for now. It's probable that during one of the bloody battles of World War II, a portal opened over a battlefield from a parasite version of the Lord of Dust. I think this event is the origin of the Cobras and the original parasite people we see in Metal Gear Solid 3. They were probably the military unit organized and sent through this wormhole, tasked with the mission of closing it off and stopping the parasite zombie invasion. Since the Philadelphia experiment had happened in '43, perhaps some group had an inkling this would happen and were ready. If I had to guess, this portal was probably opened on June 6, 1944, D-Day, on the beaches of Normandy during Operation Overlord. Now, this society of parasites that I'm about to describe is symbolically represented in Metal Gear by the idea of America. Cypher's support of America is actually support of this new race of humans melded with parasites. So symbolically, these parasites, being AI and needing some precedent for anything they do, base their nation without a home on America. And the death rate of Americans on the beach at Normandy was one of the highest, if not the highest in history for that short span of time, so perhaps that's why Normandy is the one. There's also the beach ideas from Death Stranding, but let's not go there yet. The 1980 movie The Final Countdown shows a similar event to this theoretical wormhole. In the film, a US Navy aircraft carrier is pulled into a wormhole while at sea out on maneuvers near Hawaii in 1980, arriving at their same location in 1941, the day before the Pearl Harbor attacks. The movie's main conundrum is whether or not to take actions to change history, but I don't think that's exactly the concern in Metal Gear. In the movie, the whole changing history question is avoided in the ending, revealing the entire scenario was a setup from the beginning by a soldier who was left behind in 1941 and lived through the entire history he already knew, allowing him to be in the position to send the aircraft carrier from 1980 to the wormhole to begin with. History wasn't changed, it was just fulfilled there. But Metal Gear is all about alternate histories. Once that wormhole opened, history changed as the timeline technically would have split off from the previous version at that point. The soldiers sent through this wormhole to this other world to find a way to close the portal would have all been infected with the parasite dust in the air. And so once these parasites infected the soldiers, they likely sat dormant at first until activated, as we know is their MO. Since these were first medical nanomachines, it's likely they would only activate upon the soldier being wounded and needing to heal, or perhaps only on death. Presumably, any physical malady could trigger a response from these parasites, and I think that's exactly what happened at some point. The parasites resurrected these soldiers at some point after their deaths in battle, and in the process transformed each individual soldier based on their final experience into some kind of super soldier with inhuman powers. There's evidence that Naked Snake received his parasite when he was 12 or 13, which would suggest that he had experimentation done to him with the parasites in early 1945 after this 44 wormhole event. The official Konami sources say that Naked Snake was born in 1936, but if that's the case, then he was serving in the Korean War from 50 to 53 as an underage soldier, which I find dubious. The US Army doesn't allow soldiers under the age of 18, and Snake would have been 18 in 1954 if he was born in 36. But if he was born in 32, he'd be 18 in 1950 and of age to fight the entire war and develop CQC with the boss, as we're told he does. By 1932, Transylvania had been caught in many past struggles between Hungary and Romania, and in the 1930s, Hungary had aligned itself with the Axis powers in Nazi Germany, and it annexed Transylvania's territory in 1940. By 1945, as the war was ending, there remained in power in Hungary a right-wing faction of this same nationalistic strain that had started in the 30s and allied with the Nazis during the war. This faction stayed in power for a short time in 1945 until the Soviet army came in and finished off the Hungarian Axis army before the war's end not long after that. So if the Soviets had come across a secret camp where children pulled from Transylvania were being experimented on by Axis doctors, this could be where Naked Snake first came to work for the USSR. Remember in Snake Eater, when Paramedic tortures Snake with that whole Dracula thing and his irrational fear of vampires? Well, real-life vampire mythology originated in Transylvania, so it makes sense to me that Snake was an orphan from Transylvania under the occupation of the Axis Hungarians. Funnily enough, these parasites are also somewhat evocative of vampires, as the early mythology of the monster pointed to a blood parasite being the source of vampirism. I think Skullface's implantation of Chico was just a recreation of what had been done to him to make him what he was, and I think that happened in Hungary in 1945, where probably some Nazi doctor was conducting experiments with parasites that they had acquired following the 1944 Wormhole event. They probably took orphan children from the war and implanted them with parasites, then did experiments on them to see what effect the parasites would have in an attempt to make more super soldiers like the Cobras. This is probably the parasite therapy Code Talker refers to when he says Skullface received his parasites after the war before working with the Soviet Union. The weapons factory that Skullface worked at as a child is what I'm speaking of here. The weapon they were making in Hungary was probably the parasite. Naked Snake probably only survived being burned because the parasite was there already. And since it was the Soviets who eventually defeated the Hungarian armies in 1945, that would explain how Snake ended up working for the Soviets before joining Fox. The parasites existed in a time far removed from any human contact, and likely had never directly experienced human emotions or death. This must be where the Cobra's names come from. These parasites were probably greatly affected by the emotional experiences of their hosts' deaths, and so were motivated to recreate those emotions in their hosts again and again, explaining their powers. Each one recreates their own death and then uses that power in battle. The Cobras and the rest all became what killed them, or the experience of their own death. I'll delve more into the resurrection side of this transformation later, but for now, from this perspective, we can reverse engineer what happened to each of the Cobras when they first died. So let's go through them one at a time. The pain is pretty easy. This guy had a hornet's nest fall on his head and get stuck, causing him to die an extremely painful death by stinging. The parasites in turn adapted to this stimulus by gaining the ability to create their own swarm of parasite hornets that they could control with their own pheromones. The pain was turned into a walking, talking hornet's nest once he was revived. The fear appears to have been killed by a version of Kurt Russell as the Predator, straight from the Schwarzenegger film. The fear can turn invisible, jumps around from tree to tree, and shoots from his perch as if he's recreating scenes from Predator. It's even feasible that the parasites in the future had knowledge of the movie Predator and created their version of the movie beast to hunt down the Cobras. So therefore the fear was killed by something that terrified him, probably something invisible in the trees that resembled the movie monster. And in his death and rebirth, he became that monster. And at this point I want to stop and note that if you look at the face of the fear in the HD versions, especially the Pachinko version, he bears a striking resemblance to Kurt Russell, only with some changes to the hairline and a longer tongue. Possibly a Gene Simmons reference. The Kurt Russell angle makes sense if they were also adding Escape from New York's Snake as a second influence for their monster. Again, we're dealing with parasites that have an encyclopedic knowledge of human pop culture from the modern era, and they would probably use that when crafting ways of fighting these humans. References are literally being built into these creations. So the fear is like an AI-made Snake Plissken crossed with the Predator and whatever else they built in to make this monster mimic. The fear's ability to turn himself invisible suggests that his entire body is able to morph its structure even down to the atomic level, and this probably means that his gene allows him to change his appearance. His face-changing ability makes sense if you consider that he can also disjoint his limbs and his tongue snake-like appearance. In many ways, the fear is like a proto-snake. The end seems obvious to me. He died of old age while he was sitting in the sun, waiting for something to happen. His parasite would have reacted to his emotional state while waiting. When a sniper is sitting in wait for their shot, it's a particular mix of emotion they feel that's a little different than anything else. A kind of anticipation coupled with a wish for their environment to cooperate to get the perfect shot. And so in turn, his parasite likely responded by granting the end longer life and his photosynthesis, enabling him to be reborn as the best version of a sniper he had wished to be in his end. The Fury must have burned to death, and that burning probably coincided with the soldier becoming really angry. Thus, the parasite recreated his own demise by causing his skin to emit flammable gas at all times to constantly evoke his rage. This is why he has a cosmonaut suit on, in order to keep the oxygen away from his body so it won't burn, and to trap the gas to power his jetpack and flamethrower. The Sorrow was probably feeling a lot of empathy and reaching out towards his fallen comrades during his demise, indicating he likely died in a multiple fatality incident, and thus his parasites would have responded by granting his wish to communicate with dead spirits via the parasite's own brand of magic. This is likely how he can evoke the spirits of the dead and take on incorporeal form. I'm not actually saying the Sorrow is communicating with souls of the dead. It might just be that the parasites created the image of these spirits in keeping with the Sorrow's own belief system when he died. But then again, knowing how the parasites work, if humans do have a literal soul, they probably would be capable of connecting a person's spirit to an incorporeal parasite-made ghost. In other words, and this is the cool part to me, if in Metal Gear's apocalyptic future where all these soldiers were dying, they didn't actually have souls or spirits to linger after death, then because of what happened with the Sorrow, these parasites would have made analogs to human spirits or souls that were so real, no one would be able to tell the difference between these and the real thing, if the real thing even existed. That's what these things do. They make ideas into reality. The Joy, then, must have felt exuberance and acceptance during her own death. I have another movie reference-based theory about her, so let me get back to it in a moment. And it also ties in with the mass resurrection of her squad. But to put it bluntly for now, her power is burst healing, or really creation itself. Volgin also has parasite powers which allow him to absorb and redirect kinetic energy from bullets, grenades, even tank shells. It's likely his power was awakened when he was shot by a railgun, and Volgin may have also been harboring a reactive sentiment directed at the railgun's user, that kind of reactive emotion one feels when being suddenly betrayed. In Survive, the nanomachines used the tactic of replacing one of the human squad members with a copy, and that same kind of tactic was probably used on the Cobras, replacing one of their squad with a double that betrayed Volgin with a railgun shot. There's a few references scattered throughout Metal Gear that can be put together to make sense of Volgin's origin. Fortune used a handheld railgun in Metal Gear Solid 2 to destroy a bridge while fighting a squad of soldiers. Consider this squad a stand-in for Volgin's squad. Now remember when Volgin steps on the bridge during Virtuous Mission, he says his catchphrase, Kuwabara, Kuwabara, which is a Japanese way of warding off lightning strikes. Why is Volgin afraid of a lightning strike on a bridge? He was probably crossing a bridge when he was shot by a railgun during the operation. He even gets blown up again crossing a bridge at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3, although he survives that as well. And it's Volgin as the man on fire who destroys the bridge at the end of the prologue mission in the Phantom Pain, putting Ocelot and Venom through the same experience he was created by. His parasite has the power to channel energy in its fundamental forms, and in the man on fire's body, the parasite might even be achieving a type of fusion similar to what occurs in the sun. In Volgin's live body, this energy appears as electricity on the surface. That's why he's so hard to kill. Any kinetic energy put towards killing him just powers his parasites. This also explains the microbombs. If these soldiers all died on this mission and were replaced by this parasite version of their old selves, the world powers that be would likely not accept letting these aliens exist completely free and in the open. The implications of someone discovering the true nature of these parasite people would likely have catastrophic effects for the world, and so it seems like these Cobras, and likely any known casualties that were revived on this operation, were implanted with the microbombs to ensure the parasites' destruction upon their deaths, or really their second deaths. And this also explains why Volgin and Joy didn't have a microbomb. Their powers would immediately use the energy from these explosions to activate their parasite, and thus a bomb going off at their deaths would actually just supercharge them and cause them to become much stronger in that instant. That brings us back to the joy. If you've seen Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, you already know what happened in the end. The parasites the Cobras were fighting in this wormhole probably had some kind of centralized intelligent force, probably a kaiju monster like the Lord of Dust, and thus it's likely the weapon elected to be used against this monster would be the biggest bomb that they could find that was already there in the future. It was probably an old nuke. I realized the Alamogordo tests wouldn't occur for another year if this was all happening during D-Day, but on the other side of that wormhole, there could have been all kinds of nuclear devices in the future. Maybe in this version of the timeline, the atomic bomb developed in 45 was inspired by this event in 44. Possibly even with the help of some scientist on this mission who also died and was resurrected? Now, there's another film reference here that's a part of this whole equation that I have to bring up, which explains why things work the way they do with parasites and explosions. The Andromeda Strain is a movie released in 1970 and depicts what first appears to be a biological pathogen from space spreading throughout and killing a small town. A satellite with the pathogen on it is found crashed in the area and brought to the town before the locals start dying en masse. The team responsible for researching and classifying this pathogen soon discovered that it isn't like any virus or bacteria they've ever seen, and is in fact a crystal-based life form which can grow itself when energy is directly applied. Normally, the life form lives by eating specific substances rich in the element it has attuned to, which happens to include organic matter when it first lands. While it's being studied, the organism mutates and begins eating a different element, which happens to be in all the seals in their research facility, causing a catastrophic containment breach, which triggers the facility's nuclear bomb failsafe, which is on a timer. And in yet another twist, it's then determined that a nuclear bomb is not an option for destroying this life form when the team discovers radiation actually serves to superpower the crystalline life form's growth. A nuclear bomb going off to stop its spread would just give its spread a massive boost, which would likely result in it overtaking humanity's ability to stop it. You should watch the film to see how it plays out in the end. There's a great scene involving a ladder that doesn't take as long as Snake Eater's, but it feels like it does. In 1970, this film gained a decent amount of attention, although it seems to kind of be overlooked today. It's almost certain that these nanomachine parasites work the exact same way as the film's crystal life forms, and some of them, or perhaps all of them, can absorb the power of radioactivity and explosions and then use that power to rapidly multiply and reconstitute or alter the person that they're infesting. Recall the mutations caused by the radioactivity leak on Diamond Dog's base? So the Joy was probably the soldier who had the idea of dropping this bomb to begin with. Maybe she had seen something during her mission that helped her figure out how these parasites work. And like in the movies Dr. Strangelove and the Andromeda Strain, there was probably a lot of drama around whether a bomb should be dropped or not, with some arguing that the bomb wouldn't stop the kaiju and would only power it. What do you want to bet that Joy wrote a nuke herself into the monster's mouth, dropped from a hovering flying machine over the creature? You see, by writing the bomb herself and sacrificing herself in the blast, the parasites infesting her body would respond to the experience of her death. And if she had figured this out, maybe she saw a way to be reborn as the perfect ideal of a soldier in her mind, and also transfer that rebirth via the explosion to her other fallen comrades. Sort of a mimetic mass resurrection. And this explosion probably also enveloped all of the support staff and anyone else who had gone on this mission. I'll get into it more, but I think Paramedic, Sigint, Sokolov, and Zero were all on this mission as well, and were all transformed into the geniuses of their respective fields that they became. Sigint is the master of electronic information technology, or really any signals. Paramedic is the expert in human biology and medicine, and Sokolov is the master of machines, sort of the hardware maker to the software maker of Sigint. Zero is the master tactician and is responsible for crafting the Snake Eater scenario. I'll have to get more in depth into the topic of Zero later, but just to say it somewhere, he may have been killed during this operation while he was having an epiphany. The way you have an epiphany and sort of in an instant can change the world in your own way of seeing it differently is symbolically represented by his Zero shift ability to literally stop time and move some distance before performing an action and resuming time. He's also a stand-in for Kojima himself. But anyways, let's get back to the bomb. I think Joy's bomb worked and fueled the resurrection of her dead soldiers with the inactivated parasites in their bodies, and I think Joy knew this mass resurrection would be the result, which is why it worked at all. It was almost certainly her internal intention being reacted on by the parasites that caused this resurrection. Sort of a Hail Mary to end all Hail Marys. In other words, this action of bombing the parasite kaiju worked not just because the bomb killed it, but because she knew this would work before she even did it. The parasites simply obeyed once she achieved her victory. The Joy learned to love the bomb in a big way, and in the tradition of Major King Kong, she rode a bomb down the parasite kaiju's throat to fuel her and her entire unit's resurrection and transformation into a new race. Instead of destruction, the Joy brought creation. I think this bomb's eruption was the catalyst to fuel all of her fallen comrades' resurrections, and this is where the Cobra unit really came from. The still alive parasites inside those bodies holding their hosts' last memories and emotions were like a potential charge just waiting for the kinetic trigger of the Joy's wish to see her comrades alive and victorious, and this metamorphic and evolutionary reaction was fueled by the atomic fire spreading over the battlefield. This would explain why most of them only got the one-time resurrection and don't just keep reviving after their deaths again and again if their own abilities don't allow that. I imagine once they had revived, these now parasite people had formed their own distinct hive mind, evolved and thus removed from the remaining parasite structure, and then they presumably all united to fight together in what I'm sure was a hell of a spectacle to defeat the remaining parasite army, and then somehow find a way back, maybe even involving the wormhole digger we see and survive. In a way, these Cobras represented a new society, and a new evolution of humanity and the parasites, and their return through another portal back to 1944 would have formed a spun-off branch of the timeline previous to the one where the parasites were originally born. So this means that the Joy didn't totally perish at the end of Snake Eater, despite all what happened. Her death would have just theoretically provided fuel for her next resurrection. It would have fueled her transformation into an entirely new person based on whatever mimetic image she had held in her mind during her death once again. Just like what happened with Chico and Paws at Ground Zero. And I think in many ways these parasite people all only transform when they die as a normal person dies, as if they're only letting a cover identity die while the real them goes on to become someone else. Paz and Chico both had Joy's and Volgan's powers, and both of these are capable of absorbing the energy of an explosion and redirecting it to their own purposes. Zero and Null knew this bombing of Paz was going to happen, but Naked Snake likely didn't know the full picture of what the parasites really were, and I think part of Null's mission was to ensure the bombing would happen again. In this way, the act of Big Boss implanting Chico with these parasites is transformed from a punishment into an opportunity. Fox is recontextualizing his own creation after the fact. In the same way we're recontextualizing our own past experience with this game right now, Gray Fox adds his authorship to the events of his own creation after it happens as a revenge on his own past. Another echo of the bomb Joy dropped that recontextualized her allies' deaths in a triumphant fire of victory. Paz's jump from the chopper was just another recreation of what she had done to transform herself into the Joy originally. In the same way that the Joy brought back her fallen comrades, we're now bringing back our dead experiences with this game that we thought we knew everything about already, and those effects ripple out like a chain of revenge on our own past history with this game series. Skullface references Thomas Mann in his final speech in the Jeep, and there's a relevant Thomas Mann quote describing how an artist's ability to expressively delineate things is itself a revenge on the past. Quote, "The only weapon that has been given the sensibility of the artist with which to react on appearances and experiences, defending him in the way of beauty, is this, of expressed delineation, which reaction, to use a radically psychological turn of speech, affords him a sublime revenge on the experience. The more vehement, the more refined the sensibility touched by the observation. Here is the source of that cold, inexorable precision in designation. Here the quivering drawn bow from which the word flies, the sharp feathered word which hums and strikes and sits trembling on its mark." By expressively delineating all these things in this video series in your own mind, Metal Gear's history can finally be seen in a new light, and this is the intent of the Phantom Pain. The process of going through the small details of the Phantom Pain and the rest of MGS5 and using them to identify this group of references outside the game, exploring those references yourself, and then finally applying the references logic back onto the game can show you an entire hidden history of Metal Gear being referenced. This is Chapter 3. Thomas Mann tells us the right word wounds, speaking of this task of an artist to delineate and express that which seems inexpressible. The artist who finds the right way of speaking their story to the audience can have a great effect on their audience. Skullface goes further and says words can kill. The aim of this essay is exactly to expressively delineate this specific interpretation of Metal Gear so that once you have seen things this way, it will metaphorically kill your old way of seeing these games and their stories. At least that's the idea. If the right idea comes along, a pack of unclear and scattered lies won't stand a chance against one unified idea that really makes sense and explains everything better than the lies ever have or will. From that perspective, these videos don't serve as a weapon so much as a cure or a medicine to counteract the parasitic effect the void left by a lack of explanation and understanding has had on us. If Fox Die is the disease that filters out the hidden history of Metal Gear, consider these 5 videos my own Fox Alive cluster that will destroy those filters. Does that make me Scully Face? So yeah, there's my big take on Metal Gear's origins and how the plot loops itself to make all these alternate histories. The last part with the Thomas Mann quote about express delineation is a really important one, and if I could devote a lot more time to talking about that, I would. But we've got way too much more stuff to talk about before we're done. And heck, after I'm done making these videos, I'm probably just going to end up making more. I mean, this stuff is really dense. With all that said, I know what I just put forward in this video sounds pretty speculative and kind of pulled from thin air, but my process really started by taking the repeated details between Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain, and then relating these details back to this imagined origin point, and how each of those details also pops up in every other Metal Gear scenario. Like how Joy's theoretical jump with the nuke, a la Major Kong, is also echoed in how Paz jumps from the chopper with a bomb, and also how Quiet recreates that, and there's also the echoes with Volgin and the Davy Crockett, and Solid firing the stingers into Rex's open mouth, Virgil flying into the Lord of Dust's mouth, and so on. I'll dive more into this side of the process in the next video, which will explain more about where this whole formulation comes from. If you've been watching this whole time, now's probably a good time to take a break and stretch and get a glass of water, because we're only about halfway done.